When Sheriff Arthur Schley stepped into the porch of a weather-beaten farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin, he believed he was investigating a missing person case. He was looking for 58-year-old shopkeeper Bernice Warden, the mother of his deputy, Frank Warden. But what he discovered instead would mark a new and horrifying chapter in American crime. He knocked on the front door, calling out loudly into the dead silence, but nobody answered. All clues pointed to this isolated property, and Sheriff Schley was not leaving without searching it. Luckily, the sheriff came prepared with a warrant. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. As he entered, the darkness swallowed him. Trash covered the floors. The air felt thick and stagnant, as though the house itself was decaying. It would soon become clear that the state of the home reflected the state of the man who lived there. As the sheriff made his way through the chaos and into the kitchen, something hanging from the ceiling brushed against him. He quickly turned and shone his torch on the object hanging behind him. What the sheriff encountered would turn the case upside down and transform the very definition of horror. It became the moment in history where fact became far scarier than fiction, when monsters who were once considered vampires and werewolves became human. When Sheriff Schley turned to see what he had brushed against, he was struck by the sight of a naked human carcass, beheaded, disemboweled, and hung upside down from the ceiling beam. It took seconds for the truth to sink in, and when it did, the sheriff gagged, nearly vomiting. The hanging body turned out to be the freshly gutted remains of the missing person, Bernice Warden. Later, the police would find Bernice's head in a burlap sack. Nails had been hammered through each of her ears, tied together with twine, prepared, it seemed, in readiness to be displayed as a trophy. As the investigators searched deeper into the house through the night and the following day, they uncovered a grotesque collection of human remains, which included bowls fashioned from human skull caps, a corset made of a woman's torso skinned from shoulders to waist, leggings stitched from human leg skin, the skin of a woman's face used as a mask, several chairs upholstered with human skin, and a lampshade made from the skin of a human face. These were only a few of the trophies this individual was preserving. The owner of the residence, Ed Gein, had some serious explaining to do. But who was Ed Gein, and how does someone evolve into such a monster? A close look at his childhood may provide several clues. Edward Theodore Gein was born on 27th of August 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He was the youngest of two sons born to George and Augusta Gein, both of German descent. Henry, his older brother, was 7 years his senior. From the beginning, Augusta dominated the household. She was a fiercely religious and controlling woman and was determined to raise her boys according to her strict moral code. Augusta believed the world was innately immoral. She would endlessly preach about the evils of alcohol, the wickedness of society, and the belief that all women, except her, were promiscuous instruments of the devil, hoping to discourage any intimate desires the boys might have had for fear of them being cast down into hell. Augusta would forbid her boys to ever have girlfriends, or even friends. She believed that isolation was protection. Although she was extremely tough on her sons, Ed idolized and completely worshipped his mother, both fearing and loving her to an extreme degree, a fact that concerned his rebelling brother Henry, who would occasionally confront his mother in Ed's presence. To Ed, Augusta was perfection. To hear his brother speak against her was unthinkable. Every afternoon, Augusta reserved time to read to them from the Bible, usually selecting passages about murder, death, and divine punishment. Ed's father, George, on the other hand, contributed very little to the boys' upbringing. He would only involve himself when disciplinary measures were considered to be required, where he would usually use his fists instead of words. Augusta would never hit her sons. Rather, she was known to scream in their faces, saying that they were going to hell. George was an alcoholic and frequently unemployed. Augusta despised him and thought of him as a worthless creature who was not fit enough to hold down a job, let alone raise his own children. For a time in Ed's childhood, the family ran a grocery store along the village's main strip. Augusta was known to be the real force behind the family's livelihood, managing it consistently and with authority, while George was largely ineffective. In later years, Ed would confess that he saw his parents slaughtering a pig behind the building, finding himself strangely aroused at the scene. Not long after, when Ed was around 8, the family sold their business and moved to a remote 155-acre farm. This property would eventually become known as the Gein Death Farm. Augusta would take advantage of the farm's isolation to instill her hatred of the world to her boys, only allowing them to step off the property to attend school. And it was at school where Ed was bullied for his lazy eye and his speech impediment. Although he was considered an average student who was able to read well, his strange mannerisms and mother's control would cast him as an outsider, severely hindering his social development. Augusta would become the center of Ed's world as a result of his lack of friendship and sheltering from the outside world. The centering of a person with such disdain and hatred for the world would be widely believed to have played a large part for Ed's warped sense of reality, which eventually led him down the path of insanity. Later, as an adult, Ed's father George would pass away in 1940 as a result of heart failure at the age of 66, leaving the financial burden with the rest of the Gein family. Ed and his brother Henry began working odd jobs as handymen, and Ed would also babysit for his neighbors. It was babysitting that Ed really seemed to enjoy, as children were easier for him to relate to than his peers. The community saw the brothers as hard workers, reliable, and trustworthy men. During this time, tension between the brothers began to grow. Henry would frequently defy his mother's orders and would question her teachings. On several occasions, Henry would openly criticize their mother, which shocked Ed. Ed saw his mother as pure goodness and was mortified that his brother did not see her the same way. About 4 years after their father's passing, in 1944, the two brothers were fighting a brush fire that was burning close to their farm when the fire got out of control. The story goes that they separated to fight the fire, but when night fell, Ed claimed to have lost track of Henry. Once the blaze was extinguished, Ed alerted the police about his missing brother, but when the search party arrived, Ed was able to lead them directly to his brother's body. Henry was lying dead on a piece of earth that was untouched by fire, with bruises on his head but without any significant burn marks. Despite the strange circumstances, the police had ruled his death as an accident, as nobody could believe that shy Ed Gein was capable of killing anyone, especially his brother. The world would later realize that Ed Gein was far from harmless. The county coroner would list Henry's death as the result of asphyxiation due to smoke inhalation, possibly combined with heart failure. It is widely suspected that Henry was Ed's first victim, though it has not been confirmed. Henry's death would leave their mother as the only living person that Ed had left, but only for a short period. Shortly after Henry's death, Augusta would suffer from a paralyzing stroke, and Ed would devote himself to her care. During 1945, Augusta accompanied Ed to visit a man named Smith in pursuit of purchasing straw. According to Ed, Augusta saw Smith beating a dog in front of them. A woman who was not married to Smith rushed outside begging him to stop, but Smith continued and beat the dog to death. Augusta was extremely furious at the scene, not at the cruelty towards the dog, but at the woman being there. In late December of 1945, less than 2 years after Henry's passing, Augusta would pass away at the age of 67, leaving Ed's foundations shaken. In Harold Schechter's book, Deviant, he explained that Ed had lost his only friend and one true love, and he was absolutely alone in the world. Ed remained on the farm, boarding off the rooms his mother used the most, pristinely preserving them as a shrine and leaving them untouched for years, just as she kept the entire house when she was alive. After her passing, Ed would leave the remainder of the house in complete disarray. For the next decade, Ed lived alone on the farm, mostly confined to the kitchen and a small adjoining room. He spent his time reading fringe magazines about death cults, Nazi atrocities, cannibals, and human anatomy. He pored over obituaries, fixating on newly deceased women of middle age, women who resembled his mother. In the dead of night, Ed began visiting local cemeteries after learning about local recently deceased women. Ed would exhume the bodies of these women, taking them back to his residence where he took pleasure in peeling their skin from their bodies and wearing it. Over the years, Ed would acquire a collection of human body parts from his grave robbing escapades. On one occasion, A young boy that Ed would look after had visited him at his farm. Ed would show the boy human heads that he collected in his bedroom. When the young boy told people of his experience, his story was quickly dismissed as a figment of his imagination. The boy would later be vindicated when 2 other men paid a visit to Ed Gein's farm and saw the preserved heads of women. Rumors began to circulate in the town about the strange objects that Ed possessed. However, no one took the story seriously until people started disappearing years later. During the 1940s and 1950s, Wisconsin police would notice a troubling rise in missing persons cases in the small village of Plainfield. A few cases in particular would leave the police perplexed. In 1952, 2 men, Victor Travis and Ray Burgess, vanished after spending several hours at a local bar before heading out to hunt for deer. A massive search for their whereabouts turned up nothing. In the winter of 1954, 51-year-old Plainfield tavern keeper Mary Hogan, a careful and independent woman, disappeared from her place of business. She was known to only serve regular customers and would keep a shotgun behind her bar for protection. Police discovered blood on the tavern's floor that trailed into the parking lot, an empty .32 caliber bullet cartridge, and an empty cash register. The police could only speculate as to what might have happened to Mary, as similar to the other missing persons cases, they had no bodies and very little evidence. The only thing that tied these disappearances was that they all occurred in or around Plainfield, Wisconsin. Mary's disappearance remained a mystery for years. Ed Gein was initially an early suspect after he made a strange remark, saying, "She isn't missing, she's down at the farm right now." But again, nobody believed that Ed could hurt anyone and assumed that he was just making an inappropriate joke. Ed would strike again. This time, he would target local hardware store owner Bernice Warden, who was also familiar to him, occasionally buying goods from her store. Bernice was the mother of 2 children, one of which was the village's deputy, Frank Warden. On 16th of November, 1957, Frank stopped at his mother's store to check on her and found that the cash register was open and that there was blood on the floor. Bernice was nowhere to be found, but there was a clue which may have explained her whereabouts. Frank recalled that Ed Gein had been in the store the previous evening and said that he'd return in the morning to collect antifreeze for his truck. In his mother's empty store, Frank was able to find the receipt made out to Ed, written in her handwriting. With heightened suspicions, Frank alerted his fellow officers, suspecting that Ed Gein may have something to do with her whereabouts. Shortly after, Ed was found by police in a nearby store and he was taken into custody. It was around this time when Sheriff Schley ascended on the Gein farm and discovered the incomprehensible scene. Both Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden were independent women who ran their own businesses, just like Ed's mother, Augusta, had. In many ways, Ed's victims appeared to be women who reminded him of the mother he could never escape from, even after she was gone. After the discovery of Bernice Warden's corpse at Ed Gein's house, the police began an exhaustive search for the remaining parts of the farm and surrounding land. They believed that Ed had been involved in more murders and that the bodies of another 5 people would be found buried on his property. While excavations began at the farmstead, Ed was being interviewed at Wautoma County Jailhouse by investigators. At first, Ed did not admit to any of the killings, but after a day of silence, he admitted to the murder of Bernice and divulged where he'd acquired the body parts found in his house. Ed had difficulty recalling the full details of his crimes. He had told investigators that he had been in a dazed, dreamlike state during the murder. When police asked where the other body parts in his home had come from, Ed calmly explained that he had stolen them from local cemeteries. He insisted that he had not killed any of the people whose remains were found in his house. According to Ed, he was also in a daze while robbing graves. He claimed that on around 30 occasions, he suddenly woke up while standing in the cemetery, snapped out of the trance, and left the graves undisturbed before returning home empty-handed. But as the interviews continued, the horror deepened. Ed eventually admitted that he had been working on a woman suit, a macabre costume he intended to wear so that he could literally crawl into his mother's skin and become her. After days of questioning, he finally confessed to the murder of Mary Hogan. Throughout all the questioning, Ed showed no sign of visible remorse. During hours of interrogation, he discussed murder and grave robbing casually, almost cheerfully at times, as if describing something mundane. The disturbing calmness pushed the investigators to their limits. In one moment of anger, Sheriff Schley reportedly slammed Ed's head into a brick wall, an act that later caused Ed's confession to be thrown out of court due to it being obtained under duress. But by then, Ed had repeated his story freely to the other investigators. Questions now turned to Ed's sanity. His legal team recommended that he plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Psychological evaluations followed, and doctors soon described Ed Gein as emotionally impaired, with psychologists and psychiatrists asserting that he was a schizophrenic and a sexual psychopath. His mental deterioration was believed to have been shaped by his childhood and his twisted relationship with his controlling mother. From a young age, Ed struggled with a deep conflict towards women. He felt desire and attraction, but Augusta had taught him that women were corrupt and sinful. That contradiction grew over the years, eventually evolving into full-blown psychosis. As investigators continued searching the Gein farm, they uncovered the remains from 10 women. Ed swore that the remaining body parts of 8 women had been taken from local graveyards and were not murdered, but the police were skeptical. The only way to prove it was to dig up the graves themselves. After a heated debate, authorities were granted permission to exhume the graves of the women Ed had named. Each coffin showed clear signs of tampering. Many bodies, or parts of them, were missing. Despite the mounting evidence, police could not link Ed to other disappearances in the area. Legally, he could only be charged with the murders of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. Once word of the investigation spread, the story exploded across the world. Reporters flooded into Plainfield, and Ed Gein quickly became a grim kind of celebrity. People were horrified, but also fascinated. Locals who spoke to the press had mostly positive things to say about him, describing him as quiet, polite, and a little odd. They never imagined that the soft-spoken man they knew was capable of such unspeakable crimes. Many residents struggled to accept that the man who repaired their equipment and cracked strange jokes was also the person who violated the graves of their friends and their families. Eventually, Ed Gein was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial for first-degree murder. This decision outraged the community, who believed that justice had not been served. Ed was committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. Soon after, his farm and his personal belongings were put up for auction. Thousands of curiosity seekers poured into Plainfield, turning the village into a bizarre tourist attraction. Locals were furious that his home was becoming a shrine for the morbid. Then, in the early morning of 20th of March 1958, Ed Gein's house burned to the ground. The fire was suspected to be arson, but no one was ever charged. A decade later, in 1968, doctors finally declared Ed Gein competent to stand trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming. After just 1 week, the judge found him guilty of the first-degree murder of Bernice Worden. But because he had been insane at the time of the killing, he was legally acquitted and once again returned to a mental institution. For the families of Bernice Worden, Mary Hogan, and the victims whose graves were robbed, the verdict offered no comfort. They believed Ed had escaped true punishment and nothing could change the court's decision. Ed Gein spent the rest of his life in the hospital, living quietly and without disruption. Staff described him as a model patient, getting along with other patients and keeping to himself for the most part. On 26th of July 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure secondary to lung cancer at the age of 77. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery beside his mother, not far from the graves that he had desecrated. Over the years, his own gravestone was repeatedly vandalized. Souvenir hunters chipped away pieces until it was eventually stolen entirely in 2000. It was recovered the following year near Seattle. It now rests in a museum in Waushara County, while Gein lies in an unmarked grave. The bizarre story of Ed Gein has become a permanent fixture in popular culture. His crimes inspired fictional serial killers such as Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. For decades, Ed Gein lingered in the American imagination as a modern boogeyman, an unsettling reminder of how a warped childhood, isolation, and unresolved psychological trauma can twist a man into something monstrous.